Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in the day. I'm happy to present this next presenter. This is my friend, my business partner, Jeffrey McPhee. Jeffrey is a fourth generation farmer with 20 years of experience in cannabis and hemp growing, as we say farming now these days. He is VP of Horticulture at Imperial Seedlings at the company. He's in charge of not only all of the cultivars that we vet for customers, also all of the germination techniques that we use to produce world-class seedlings. Today, Jeffrey's going to talk to everyone about the difference between utilizing transplants versus clones versus versus direct sow methods whenever you're hemp farming. So I'm going to turn the session over to Jeffrey so that we can get started. And we will have a live Q&A at the end. If you'll check the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. It'll be monitored by me, and in the last 10 minutes of the presentation, we'll go through a live Q&A session with Jeffrey. So just post your questions there when you have them. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey, and we can get started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks to everybody for all the effort putting today together and getting everybody online to join the conference. It's odd times that we're living in, and this is a unique opportunity for us to be able to still connect and still share valuable information between our counterparts in the hemp industry and try to move things forward as an industry through good information and real advice that hopefully can be an added value to your farm here for the season. So with that, I'll get started on my presentation, which I've been told I can do through this fancy PDF. Here we go. So as Kim mentioned, I was going to be covering the seedling transplants versus direct sow and clones. These are the three methods that we're all very familiar with in the hemp industry as the way to begin the season. And we're going to cover each of these categories, pointing out the pluses and minuses in each one. And hopefully we can answer some questions, put some of the myth to bed, and understand what best practices are when it comes to going in the ground for your hemp crop. So I think the best place to start in regards to the hemp industry is really why we are where we are, and to go back and look at that just briefly to understand that the reason that we're in the position that we're in the hemp industry has a lot to do with the history, and that is the cannabis and hemp industry and the prohibition for 25 years. And I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly. I know that a lot of you are very familiar with it, but I think that it makes sense to touch on this and go over how important the history of this is when it comes to how we behave trying to commoditize this. So in 75 years of prohibition, there's this huge vacuum of knowledge that we didn't have modern agricultural practices. We didn't have high-level studies taking place that would normally forward the genetics and the commoditization of a crop. What we had was this kind of unchecked black market that bred in basements and in back rooms and in warehouses across North America and Europe, for that matter, that were targeting valued constituents. And this particular valued constituent for the recreational market, of course, was THC. But because it was an unchecked, unregulated market with very little connectivity, what we saw was a market that drove the breeding practices towards one valued constituent, while leaving behind a lot of the agronomic and horticultural variables that one would normally associate with quality breeding. And so we left behind things like resistance to pests, resistance to mildew and mold microbials, or resistance to abiotic stress. And those are all categories that are normally bred for in highly commoditized crops. So your corn, your soy, your apples, cherries, pears, wine grapes, hops, etc., all bred for a broad range of variables versus one. And so what some of our partners in the hemp industry are doing as we have this opportunity to scale are bringing breeding practices forward, but we're still crawling out of that detriment that was a lack of qualified breeding practices early on. So this huge vacuum and lack of information caused for a deficit in knowledge. And like I said, some of our qualified breeding partners are really helping move that forward. But in the meantime, I think a lot of the farming practices and best practices are developed off of the fact that we still have to make up for some of the instability that was bred as a result of prohibition. So that having been said, let's talk about best planting techniques for hemp genetics. And when we have young hemp genetics, we mean genetics that are only maybe 5 to 7 years in practice regarding breeding. And if we think about commoditized crops, these are often decades-long projects by companies like Monsanto or Syngenta or Cargill that go through massive programs and have decades of experience before they bring something to market. The proofing period is actually quite substantial in common agriculture. And again, while we have qualified partners that are working in this, it behooves us to really, as farmers, look at what variables can we, through input programs and practices, perform that help mitigate some of that instability that still remains because of that platform that we began with due to prohibition. And so overcoming inconsistent growth patterns in these young genetics has a lot to do, again, with your inputs and your practices as a farmer. A lot of the issues and instability can be met with input programs, but those input programs are really limited to certain methodologies in regards to early start planting or transplanting. So direct sow clones or transplants. The clones are an old carryover from the history of cannabis. The propagation or the cutting of a branch to get it to root is, again, a carryover. Direct sow being that more row crop, soybean, corn, etc. approach, and of course then transplants being that more high value crop produce category. And if we look to the high produce categories and methodologies that are used in crops that have high value or value constituent programs that demand consistency, we look and see that transplants are really the gold standard. And that's because of all of the non-prohibition studies and standards that have been developed over decades through modern agricultural practices. So moving on here, let's talk about clones. We've mentioned clones a couple of times, and we're gonna breeze through this. This is a cannabis carryover. There are very few crops that rely on cloning because of the instability that it generally provides. And while you can get consistent genetics by, I mean, it's in the word, a clone is a clone. It's a near copy of the mother plant, a propagated branch that has near identical genetics. It's not perfect, but it's near. It's not tissue culture, but it's close. You also get a fully feminized population through the propagation from a female plant. So those are the two pros that the cannabis industry really leaned on for those 75 years, because seeds were expensive, it was illegal, and the idea of producing a lot of seeds came with a lot of consequence. And so really, as a result of legislation and risk, clones became the go-to standard, popular way to propagate genetics in the cannabis industry, but it's not a scalable methodology. Cannabis grows were small, hemp grows originally were very, very small. As we scale forward, the labor-intensive nature of clones are simply just not, you can't bring that to scale effectively with the amount of labor and the amount of risk that comes along with them. Clones have very weak root development. There's no taproot development. Their cell wall thicknesses are incredibly weak, so they're very susceptible to pests, mold, mildew, all sorts of cross-vectoring of diseases and viruses because they're grown generally in homogeneous watered programs or aquaponic programs that share all of that viral connectivity, which I'm sure all better understand now how quickly that can spread given the condition that we're in today. We mentioned the labor costs, of course, during production and how expensive those are. But then when we go to transplant these weakened plants, and they can look healthy, green, and strong, but to take a transplant from a clone setting into an outdoor field, they're very highly susceptible to stress. They're very highly susceptible to high attrition rates and to succumbing to some type of abiotic stress reaction that really can send the genetics awry. So ending up with stress reaction results, things like hermaphrodation or full-on attrition, so on and so forth. So again, clones, just a very weakened version, not a real scalable version to date when we talk about the type of plant density and acreage that's needed to meet demand in the hemp industry. So again, clones, a fairly old school, not up to date, classic cannabis methodology that's something that just needs to go the way of the dinosaur. So that having been said, direct sow. Direct sow is your classic, put a seed in the ground. Very common in probably about 60% of row crops in the United States are direct sow versus transplant. And those are generally your lower price commoditized crops like soybean, corn, etc. Your higher value crops, generally speaking, are going to be from transplants. Direct sow, for those that are in the know, and a lot of customers that we talk to are current direct sow farmers, and they're very, very good and very skilled at getting a seed to pop in the ground on time. The problem with that, in my opinion, in the hemp industry is that if we go back to that instability, most direct sow farmers are used to getting a qualified seed from Cargill or Monsanto or Syngenta, so forth, seed that has decades and billions of dollars in development and has all sorts of resistances built into its genetics through that really extensive global effort that these companies put forward in producing qualified genetics. And so while that may work for stable genetics that you might find on the market today, in our industry, we have this residual instability. While it is waning, it still exists. It's still a reality that we have to deal with for the next several years at least. And the direct sow methodology brings out a lot of the traits that are really unfavorable in the hemp industry as a whole. We talk about germination rates and attrition. This is very expensive seed. The seed companies that are qualified have put an enormous amount of time and money. There's a shortage of quality supply, and the seed is expensive as a result by comparison to that of a commoditized crop. But the prices are also better on the back end than they are with a commoditized crop. So, but with that upfront cost in mind, attrition rates through germination and direct sow are an expensive way to look at getting into the ground. Not only is it expensive to get in the ground, you are very, very likely to succumb to some type of abiotic stress event that will trigger some variation in those genetics. And to avoid that, really, you need to be able to concentrate your germination in a space where you can baby them. And that's why we're going to talk about transplants here in a second by comparison to direct sow. The amount of acreage that you have to cover with direct sow, as an example, if I'm going to grow 27 acres of hemp, I have to maintain that 27 acres of hemp. All the water, all the labor, all the materials and inputs, pest management systems, all the biostimulants, all the abiotic stress inhibitors, over 27 acres. We can do that in about 412 square foot in a greenhouse. The concentrated ability to be able to add high-end valued products in a greenhouse setting for transplants versus having to spread that cost across acreage doesn't make a lot of mathematical sense when we talk about direct sow being possibly cheaper than transplants. I really think that the money that has to go into avoiding some of the instability that we see in our genetics can be overcome through mitigating that with concentrated value inside of a greenhouse with transplants. Again, so that we can use high-end products in a concentrated space, whereas in a direct sow position, you're really going to have to put down an enormous amount of product, time, and labor by comparison to what we can do. And having that 40 to 50 day window of cost savings, I think mitigates for a lot of the myth that it's cheaper to go on the ground with direct sow than it is with transplants. Because of the position that we're in with genetics and because of the input systems that can be applied in a greenhouse setting, direct sow acreage is a riskier play in my opinion. I think it works great with a lot of crops. I do think that in certain regions and microclimates in the next maybe 7 to 10 years, we'll have very stable, true to type seed from some of these great breeders that we're working with now that will be applicable to direct sow. Right now, I think that a farmer's best bet to mitigate risk is to make sure that those plants avoid all of that early stress and avoid all of that genetic variance that can occur as a result by switching to transplants versus direct sow. And that's really the biggest argument that I have, in regards to what's the best decision-making process for a farmer. And I do think that risk mitigation, I mean, if you've farmed long enough, you know that it's all about risk. And any time that you can shave down those variables in your favor, you're very likely to have a better year. And that's really, at the end of the day, how I was taught to farm. So let's keep going through the slides here. Excuse me. So we've kind of touched on in the last slide why it's our thought process at Imperial Seedlings that transplants are the golden standard currently in the hemp industry. Increased germination rates are an obvious point to talk about. The cost of the seed, the need to have good stands that develop quality canopy to get the yield per acre. This is a high value crop, it's an intensive crop, but germination rates need to be on point. We can really mitigate for that in a controlled setting, for instance, in very high quality greenhouses. We talked also in the last slide about affordable solutions to the application of stress mitigation. Because of the slight instabilities, again, breeders are doing a very good job. I'm not going to try and throw anybody under the bus here. We have gone light years in the last 5 years because of the efforts of a lot of genetics companies in this industry, but that instability still exists. We're not true to type commoditized seed yet. And as a result, mitigating for that abiotic stress reaction, which can cause genetic variance, cause phenovariance, cause hermaphrodation, cause all sorts of issues in susceptibility to pests and microbials, etc., can be applied affordably in a concentrated setting. Transplants allow for that. In a facility like Imperial Seedlings, I'm able to put so much value into a tray of plants versus an acre of plants that you're getting a plant that has made it through the most dangerous window of time in its life cycle. It's one most valuable area of life cycle where it will succumb to some abiotic stress and cause some type of variable in its genetic pattern. So when you can get through that window effectively with a healthy plant that has good root structure, that has all of the qualities that you're looking for, all the traits that you paid for with that seed, that all these breeders went to great lengths to provide, you can maintain that genetic quality through early life cycle care. At the end of the day, that allows for precision farming, a homogeneous stand of plants that is as close to true to type as the industry can offer today, and that allows a farmer to plan for the year. If I've got a stand of apples, cherries, pears, wine grapes, hops, cannabis, hemp, you name it, any of my previous crops, the ability to have consistency across acreage allows for me to save so much money in harvest, and so much in processing. And it is just precision farming to a T. This is modern agriculture. The more homogeneous you can have it, the more effectively and efficiently you can move through your season when it comes to harvesting, processing, and selling your product. A lot of these big companies that are going to be buying your biomass at the end of the year are looking for some type of homogeneous product that can carry over their brand. The last thing they want to have to do is change their extraction or change their brand because there's no homogeneous quality to your crop. Same thing goes across every other commoditized crop out there. So having that precision, having that consistency through your crop by mitigating that early life stage is really important in my opinion. We did mention earlier the root systems, clones, very, very weak. Direxo can be strong given it doesn't undergo any major abiotic stress events. You can see all sorts of variants in lateral root growth through abiotic stress responses in hemp, and having that transplant with that strong background, all those quality ingredients put into that plug so that it's got the best start really helps get things going in the right direction. And again, helps with that overall yield and production of valued constituents. Plants that have been bred to the point that these breeders have taken them are supercars. These things are built like you're trying to grow a pumpkin at the county fair. They are meant to express valued constituents and in such levels that it's almost beyond the genetics capabilities. So in order to make sure that you get to that level, you have to start with a great breeder, make sure that that plant is cared for properly, understand your input IPM programs, your harvest post-harvest biologies, and you can do this. It's all there, guys. I think that with the right network and the right group of people, that there is a best practices category coming to the hemp industry, and we're excited to be a part of that and working with partners that help provide us with that, and taking the science to this and trying to not again, I don't want to knock the 75 years of prohibition. There were a lot of ingenious people that did a lot of amazing things, and we are built off of that foundation. But we're finally
kind of for a little Q&A, if that's cool, Jeffrey.
Oh, am I running long? I tend to.
Well, you know, we've got about 8 minutes left, and we've got a few questions coming in.
I'd be happy to.
If we could just open up for just a couple of questions, because just to let everybody know, this full presentation will be available to all attendees. You know, one of the questions we had coming in says, talk to me about what you mean when you talk about 40 to 50 days of operational cost across total acreage. How are we kind of getting to that 40 to 50 days?
So that's, you know, really the amount of time that a plant would spend in our facility. So that time spent in our facility under a concentrated space is a concentrated value of expense. If you were to take that same number of plants and put it across acreage, then you're now caring for that acreage in full. The watering, the inputs, the IPM, all of those early stage critical moments can be done at full acreage, but it's very expensive by comparison to concentrating that value in a greenhouse, in a tray, giving those plants that best chance start with best practices in a space, again, that's so concentrated, you're gaining value through lack of expense. Does that answer that properly?
Yeah, I think so. Another question, we've got a couple of questions here about what are we defining as abiotic stress?
So there's one of the things that we've been studying and are very excited to, we've started trials here about 8 months ago. We're working on our second set of trials regarding abiotic stress reactions. And what we're finding is that hemp, much like that of hops and cannabis, have a very low tolerance to ethylene gas off. And when a hemp or cannabis plant undergoes an abiotic stress event, so let's say transplant shock, let's say any type of weather event, say high heat, rain, wind, when you say do direct sow, and you've got a young, vulnerable seedling in the ground, when a plant undergoes a stress event, it reacts accordingly. It hardens off, it does all sorts of things. But in regards to hemp and cannabis, because of that mild instability, what we see is an ethylene gas off and then a reactive reaction all the way through plants that are nearby, and it spreads. I mean, it is something that has yet to be solved for via genetics, but there are input programs and farm practices that can be utilized to mitigate abiotic stress so that that plant is not going to react in a detrimental way, especially with the genetics, so that it's not going
You have a
to.
couple of tips on what those practices may be, because that is actually one of the other questions. I know we're going to go into more things probably in the agronomy session, but if you just had a couple key tips to kind of prevent those abiotic stress events.
Really avoiding direct sow is my go-to for that. The susceptibility of that plant in early stages of life, that's where we don't see nearly as much reaction in a mid-sized or fully mature plant in abiotic stress or ethylene gas off categories. What we see is in very young plants, from cracking the seed all the way through to, say, about a 10 to 12 inch plant, the plants react very, very easily to any type of ethylene gas off, which is, again, a reaction to abiotic stress events, which is a wide range of things. There's a multitude of things. So I think the best practices in regards to mitigating that is having transplants grown in very well controlled environments and by companies that understand that understand this is not tomatoes, peppers, this is not your classic produce transplant. There's some additional science that has to be applied in order to have a quality product that is going to make that farmer get the genetics that he paid for and have so much less to have to overcome later on in life cycle by mitigating for that early on.
Okay, that's awesome. I think that we have time for probably the two last questions before
Sure.
we wrap up. Ellen asks, what's your opinion on micro-propagation?
Micropropagation or tissue culture, I think, is phenomenal. I think that it will be the go-to. Imperial Seedlings is working with several partners in regards to learning more about how to scale qualified tissue culture. There have been breakthroughs in the past 5 or 6 years in regards to hardwood tissue culturing, and we're working with some of those companies in regards to how to best move forward with tissue culture. It's very effective. There's no genetic wash off. It is a taproot driven carrying. It pops like a seed at the end of the day, but it is so costly. There's just no way to afford it. You can't bring it to scale. Whereas clones cap off because of labor, tissue culture and micro propagation are so incredibly expensive and labor intensive that it's hard to do over acreage. I think we're probably 10, 12 years away from seeing really solid to scale tissue culture. And that'll really be in very specific areas of hemp or cannabis, depending on the valued constituent, depending on the end product. I think that we'll see a multitude of approaches to this based on the farm's targeted market.
I think a follow-up question that we're seeing here in regards to how long it takes to germinate the starts. Germination can take place in a range of time, right? It can take place in as little as 3 weeks and then up to 4 to 5 weeks. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it varies on genetics. So the amount of vigor, the vigor rate, which is a measurable unit, is something that really determines how quickly that plant is going to throw its stinger or taproot and then lateral root development on top of and past the clotted leaf. So generally speaking, it should take about 4 to 6 weeks. I think that 4 to 5 week category is best. It can't be rushed. If there's a lot of companies out there that will, I can get you plants in 2 to 3 weeks. Dumping nitrogen and getting these things to get tall quick is not the way to do it. The reason we're in Southern California as a company, as a good example, is the amount of light that we use, the full sun unshaded sun, and the number of times that we give our plants unshaded sun through the day helps build that stacked internode and that fibrous crown, which helps with capillary tear for transplants, helps with stress mitigation. Really having a transplant done in the right conditions is also very, very important for this. Again, if we can get that fibrous crown development and a hardened off transplant, the chances for it to succumb to any major abiotic stress event is so much less that it certainly behooves one to look for the qualified producer when we talk about transplants.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Jeffrey, and everything that you've given talking about the difference between these different planting methods. I look forward to seeing everyone at the next session when we get started here at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time with Kyle Truesdell and Agronomy 101. If everyone can take a look at their link, they can click directly into it starting at 11. And also all the links are available on our website. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for your time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next session.
Thanks, Kim.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Stay safe.